Hi, my name is Michael Reike, and I'm the principal Couchbase developer for Spring Data Couchbase. And I'm going to talk to you about collection support in Spring Data Couchbase 4.3. That is, it's available in preview milestones and is going to be released in November. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of collections for Couchbase, and then with respect to Spring Data, collection support for templates and collection support for repository. And then I'll go through the usage of collections in a sample application. And if we have a little bit of time at the end, I'm going to go through a new options feature that's available. It's a little bit related to collections. So you can think of buckets. The easiest way to think of collections is to think that they're analogous to catalog schemas and tables in a SQL database. So in Oracle, you'll have catalogs, schemas, and tables. In Couchbase, the same idea is conveyed in buckets, scopes, and collections. The collections are available in the server since 7.0 release this summer, and they were available as early as 6.5 as a developer preview. A bucket contains scopes, and scopes contains collections. So just again, like catalogs, schemas, and tables. There's a special scope called the default scope, which is called _default, which contains a default collection called _default. The default scope can have non-default collections, and this is a little bit subtle, but non-default scopes cannot have a default collection. So you might have the expectation that you can have both, but it's only the default scope that can have a default collection. Therefore, documents in a non-default scope must be in a non-default collection. So as you're using it, you might get errors or complaints that you're trying to do something different. And the last point I have is that authorization is by scope, so you can narrow down the authorization more than just on a bucket. You can have different scopes in the same bucket with different authorizations on them. And here's a list of the benefits of collections. This list is from the link there. So they're a logical group of similar documents, potentially simplifying operations such as query and cross data center replication and backups and restores. They increase the efficiency of indexing. They simplify querying, since the statements are easily able to specify other subsets of documents. There's no need to specify the type equals order or what you've been used to doing in buckets. There's easier migration from relational databases to Couchbase Server, since the collections can be designed to correspond to pre-existing relational tables. And again, the scopes are like schemas and the buckets like catalogs. You can isolate different document types within a bucket by putting them in different scopes, and the applications can be specifically authorized to use only the appropriate subset of data. In collections in Spring Data Couchbase, the scope name can be configured in the get scope name. So the base method results in the use of the default scope, the _default or no scope. Other scopes can be potentially used with templates and repositories. So there's APIs on the templates and repositories that we'll get into later, and that will allow you to use different scopes other than the default scope. If scopes require different authorization, repository operations mapping is required, and I have not covered that. It's similar to how you map different buckets, the repository operations mapping for buckets. In Spring Data Couchbase, we still use the class property, so there's no data migration required, and you could switch back and forth from using scopes and collections to not using them without changing your data. So again, a little recap of what I mentioned before is that if no scope is provided, the default scope is used. If no collection is provided, the default collection is used. If the scope specified is not the default, and a non-default collection will be required for KV and nickel operations. So there's no default collection in a non-default scope. And if an operation is on the default collection, in the default scope, the bucket is used instead of the collection. This allows compatibility with servers that don't support collections. For templates, so some of the specifics about using collections in Spring Data templates. The templates will use the scope from the configuration if it's used without a scope being provided to the operation. And the scope can be provided to an operation by using the @scope annotation on the entity class, or on the operation using the in-scope scope name Fluent API. I'll show those in a bit. Likewise, the collection can be provided by the collection on the annotation on the entity class and the in-collection Fluent API call. So that's going to look like this. So in the top is how you'd configure the default scope in the configuration class. And next is some examples of using it. So if you had that scope name, a default scope configured, and the very first line it shows there's no collection specified, so this is going to fail. It's going to tell you you can't have a default collection in a non-default scope. The second one, this will work. So it's a collection is specified called user, so it's going to get from the my test scope and the collection called user. And the third example shows maybe getting from a scope containing archived documents, and the collection blocked. So maybe you had archived users that were blocked. That's where you could get them from. So it's all from the same template. The third example, it shows using the annotations. On your document, on your entity class, there's travel airport, and the code examples. If you have that configuration and you don't specify it in the call, you'd be getting it from the travel scope and the airport collection, and by specifying just the scope in the very last line, it would get it from that scope and the configured collection airport, so archive.airport. For repositories, it's some of the same concepts. The repositories will use the scope from the configuration if none is provided from the method. So that's the get scope name method call. And a scope can be specified by annotation on the entity class, on the repository interface, or just on the method. And also the last way is with scope name on the repository proxy, which I will talk about in a little bit. And collections can be specified all the same ways on the entity class, the repository interface, the method itself, and there's a with collection on the repository proxy. So just the first couple things are, it's the same mechanism that's for templates from the get scope name and the configuration, the scope and collection on the entity class, and the extra things are so on the proxy. I mentioned the repository proxy. So when you actually use in Spring Data, when you actually use a repository, it's a proxy that's made for the interface that you've defined. And likewise, for scopes and collections, we have a proxy for the interface for your repository, and it will add onto it this with scope method call. So if you were to use this without specifying a scope or collection, you'd get it from travel.airport, which was specified in the annotations. And if you specify a different scope by using the methods from the proxy with scope, you would get it from this scope archived and the same collection airport. The next example just shows it on the scope and collections on a method itself. And so these would get it from the archived scope and the collection airport. And using that method, we'll get it from those, the scope and the collection. So I have, there's a travel sample. It's the same travel sample that you may have seen for all the other SDKs for Python and Java and so on. I've made one for Spring Data. So it's if you're not familiar with it, it comes in two parts. There's the middleware application for TryCB Spring. It uses Spring Data. The other ones, there's a TryCB Java and so on, where it uses the other SDKs. It has a front end that's the front end is the same for all the different versions of this travel sample. So it uses a travel sample bucket plus some additional indexes that it will create when you start it up. You can run the components alone or in Docker. You can mix and match the different parts. You can use your own Couchbase server. You could use your own front end. If you want to change whatever the front end looks like, the GUI, or your own copy of the middleware. The last one is probably the most useful, so you can play with the middleware application. You can change the method calls and just to experiment. So in the application, there's you can register a user, register and log in, search for airports. You can search for flights, select the flights, purchase the flights, review booking, and also do a full text search of hotels by the Java SDK directly. So I just have the screens here. This is what the first screen would look like. There's a login. If you say login and it says the user isn't registered or whatever, if you click on register, it will register the user and log in. So, and then you can. It has various searches. So when you start to type, you've probably seen this on Travelocity or Kayak or whatever you use. But when you start to type a name, it gives you the possible matching samples here. It looks them up from 3 different ways. We'll talk about that later, how it looks them up. But it fills them in, and you can type more to get a more precise match, or you can just select one from the list. After you've selected your from and to, then you can select dates for the flights, and it gives you a list. The top is the outbound flights, down below is the returning flights. From there, you select them, you put them in your shopping cart and buy them. After you bought them, you can go back and look at what flights you've booked. And then there's a full text search of hotels. So if I was going to Los Angeles, I look for something downtown, and you see it finds hotels that have downtown, whether it be in the name or the description, it gives a list of them. So now we'll go through a little bit of the code that does this. So we start off with the AirportRepository class interface. So it has a scope on inventory, and the collection is airport. And it has it has an override for for a default. There's a find all. It has an override, and you don't have to override the default ones, but I like to do it just to be clear about what methods I'm going to use. Then there's 3 different methods in here. This find by the FAA code. FAA code is the 3-letter airport code that you always see. ICAO is it's a 4-letter international code, much like the FAA codes. And then there's this @query, which has it's a handcrafted query, and it gets airports with a matching airport name. And it can, you just define it like that. It gets used exactly like you specified it, with these nickel placeholders filled in with the appropriate ones. This is the searching that where you start typing and it shows the name. So if you have 3 letters and it's the same case, then it's assuming it's a FAA code. If you have 4 letters and they're the same case, it tries to look it up by the ICAO code. And anything else, it tries to an airport name that starts with whatever you've entered. For the flight path, so this is the smarts of the whole thing, where it looks up flights from going from your source to your destination. It does the join in here. So this is I won't go into the technical part of this, but it does a join just like you do in a SQL database. And so when you looking for flights, it does 2 lookups. One first going from the source to the destination, and the second one going from the destination to the source, your return flight. Again, there's the scope is inventory that it's going to use. There are no collections mentioned. There's no collection @collection or with collection used here, because the collection names for query, the collection names are right in the query where you would normally have the table name. So here's the join. The join is from airport and on airline. Those are the collection names that it's using in the inventory scope. For the booking repository, so when you after you put in the shopping cart and buy it, it ends up in the booking repository that looks like this. The collection is named bookings, and when it's used, it's gonna, the scope will be the tenant name. So there's, the tenant is, in this case, it's travel agencies. So whenever there's a the top line in here, so this, the booking repository dot with scope and the tenant name. So that's where it figures out who it is and whose bookings it's going to be. So there could be multiple tenants, multiple agencies using the same bucket, but they have their own scope. So they're isolated from each other. And then just to find the flights, find by flight ID. So this will give it for the flights with that ID in the bookings collection in the scope of the particular tenant. So that's the airline repository travel sample. The other thing I mentioned was with options. So this is a new feature, and it's a little bit related to the scopes and collections because it uses the same mechanism. Prior to this, the options on repositories are only provided by annotations, like we had the @scope collections annotations. There's other ones for expiry and consistency and so on. And the drawback with that is that they are fixed, and at runtime you can't say make this call for this certain expiry time and then make a different call with a different expiry time. So what we've added as similar to with scope and with collections, there's a with options for the template Fluent API, and also with options for the repository proxy that will let you specify options. So these are the Couchbase specific options, get options, replace options, update options, and so on. And whatever they are supported by the Java SDK is what you can specify in there. So you never have to stop and say, well, how do I have this one query and I want to put a timeout on it. How do I specify that? You can put it always in the options and they will stick with it. Well, here's an example of using a timeout. So find by query, I want to do a timeout and of 1 second. So that's how you do it. Or on the repository, the same kind of thing. On the repository is with options and timeout. So, and there's one more thing after options. There has been discussion about how it's cumbersome to use annotations because you end up repeating them, the same thing over and over in multiple places. Well, now using the Spring Data Framework annotation utilities, there you can make annotations. You can make up your own annotations. Here I've made up my repo annotation, and it's made up of all these other annotations. And you can put, like, there's scopes, collection, expiry. You can put on them, and you can also put default values that are different than the defaults from the annotations. So you can build up your own like this, and you can use them in multiple places. So if you ever need to go across and change something, like maybe the scope that you're using, or something like that. Say you want to change the scope from a test bucket to or a test scope to a development scope or something like that, you can change them all in one place. And at the bottom, this is just how the last couple lines is how you use it. And here it uses the my repo annotation and sets the query consistency. So that concludes my presentation. There's my contact information. Also, if at the there's a resources slide at the very end, there's some useful links about how to get in touch with Spring Data Couchbase development, how to open issues, and where to find documentation and releases and that kind of thing.